My name is Peter Holland, and I'm the Associate Dean for the Arts, and I welcome you to the first winter lecture of this series. As usual in South Bend, we seem to have missed fall. I think it was last Tuesday, and then it was gone. A particular pleasure today is to welcome back an Emeritus professor from Notre Dame, because, quite simply, there is no one in the world who could possibly give this talk better, or indeed at all, instead of Charles Rosenberg. Chuck, as we've always known him, is an Emeritus Professor of Art History. His specialization is in Renaissance and Baroque art, and he taught in our Department of Art History and Design from 1981 until he retired a couple of years ago. He was the recipient of every fellowship going, from the Cress Foundation, from the ACLS, from the National Endowment for the Humanities. He was a fellow at the Harvard Center for Renaissance Studies at the Villa Itati, something I deeply envy art historians being able to do, and also at the American Academy in Rome. He's lectured throughout the US and far beyond on Michelangelo, on Leonardo da Vinci, on museums and other art historical topics. And he's also, for many years, been a participant in the Hesberg Lecture Series from 2001 to the present, which is an opportunity for us to go out and talk at alumni clubs across the country who invite us to come and give lectures. He's published over 50 articles and book reviews on topics ranging from Rembrandt to Renaissance coinage, and he's the author or editor of 5 books, and the reason why no one could possibly give this talk better than him is that just appeared is the catalogue of the Feddersen collection of the Rembrandt religious etchings that are part of the collection of the Snite Museum, and he has edited that extraordinary catalogue. And that, of course, is part of the substance of his talk. You can get it through the bookstore, you can get it from Amazon, but you can also get it up in the gallery where the etchings are on display, and he will be signing copies immediately after his talk today. So please give a warm welcome to Chuck Rosenberg. Thank you.
I clearly do not have a prayer of living up to that introduction. Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you all for coming here. It is much nicer inside right now than outside. There's no doubt about that. The talk that I'm going to be giving today actually is divided up into 4 parts. The first part will deal with the Feddersen collection itself. More to the point, the donors, Jack and Elfrida Feddersen, and also a little bit of the history about how this collection was formed and how it came to be part of the collection of the Snite through an extraordinarily generous gift. After that, I'm going to go through a very brief biography of Rembrandt. I hope it will be a little more, I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. It's pretty absurd, but anyway, hopefully what I will offer you today will be a little more accurate than Alexander Korda's biopic from the 30s. So that's the second part. The third part will introduce you to the process of printmaking, so you'll get some idea about how the objects upstairs were made. And by the way, there's always a question, what is an original print? Well, these are all original prints. I think there are only 2 of them that were printed later than the 17th century. The vast majority of them were printed during Rembrandt's lifetime or almost immediately thereafter, and they would be considered original prints. He may, in fact, have printed the majority of them himself because he attended very carefully to the printing process. He was very innovative in that in itself. And then finally, in the 4th and final part, we will actually talk about some of the prints in the collection, and I'm going to give you a few things to sort of look for as I hope you go back upstairs to peruse the actual objects themselves. So that's basically the structure of what my talk is going to be today. John Feddersen, who is better known as Jack, and his wife Elfrida lived in Elkhart, Indiana, which for those of you who are from out of town is about 15 miles to the east of us. Jacques was the president of the Selmer Kahn Instrument Company from 1960 until his retirement in 1974. He was something of an amateur artist himself, with an interest in collecting prints and drawings, and he and Elfriede initially collected primarily modern works. He still apparently had Picassos in his collection. In 1966, however, they purchased their first Rembrandt prints from a dealer in New York by the name of the Associated American Artists. It was a kind of cooperative dealership in New York. These are the two of the three prints that they purchased, Christ and the Woman of Samaria at the Well, among the ruins on the left and the stoning of St. Stephen on the right. And both of these are still in the collection, and you can see them upstairs in the gallery. And they also bought an impression of the artist's work, which is, I'm not going to show it to you, it's entitled A Scholar in His Study. It's sometimes known as the Faust. That is not part of the collection, however. Smitten by these works, they decided to focus their collecting energy almost exclusively on Rembrandt prints. And motivated in part by their faith, they elected to collect almost exclusively his religious prints. Over the next 15 or so years, Jacques, in particular, became a self-taught expert on Rembrandt, so that with his knowledge, tenacity, and keen eye, and the assistance of dealers such as David Tunick, he and Elfriede created a collection of 69 impressions of 67 religious subjects, including the artist's first and last religious prints. The one on the left, the Circumcision, is the first print that Rembrandt ever made. And he was 20 years old when he made that. And the one on the right is the last of his religious prints. He did two other prints after this, one of a female nude and one of a portrait. But this is the last of his religious prints, Peter and John healing the cripple at the temple gate. As a result of this, the collection which you see upstairs includes about 80% of the total number of religious subjects which Rembrandt printed. The Feddersons also purchased one of the artist's many self-portraits. Now, there are some interesting stories about how they went about obtaining these prints. Sometimes they even outsmarted the experts. For example, in the 1970s, Jacques began purchasing prints from the fine arts department of the London department store Harrods, including what everybody agrees is an extraordinary example of the so-called 100 guilder print. And apparently he got this at an incredibly modest price, so much so that a dealer has recounted to Sherrill Snay, who is the curator here of Western art, that it's still legendary how he was able to obtain the print, which is upstairs in the gallery. Apparently, Harrods did not really know the quality of the impression which they were selling. And then in October of 1976, Harrods contacted Jacques to let him know that they had an impression of the very rare fifth state of Rembrandt's Three Crosses. Now, every time an artist makes a change to the image on the plate, which he is printing, and we'll talk about the process in just a few minutes, he creates what is called a state. And in the case of the Three Crosses, during his own lifetime, Rembrandt produced 4 different versions or 4 states of this print. The first 3 versions have relatively minor changes to the artist's original conception, which was a kind of dramatic vision which places a strong emphasis on Longinus's let me see if I can get this thing to work. There we go. Longinus's conversion, which you can see has a kind of central place here, and also on Mary, St. John, and their comforters on the right-hand side. They're bathed in light here, so there's a strong emphasis on that. And it also includes a large number of disciples, soldiers, and other sort of secondary figures. On the whole, actually, it is a relatively optimistic vision of this, what is obviously a tragic event. In the 4th state, however, Rembrandt completely revised his conception, significantly diminishing the importance of the figure of the converted Longinus. And he is actually just barely visible at the base of the cross here, but he kind of gets lost in the shadows around the base there. He dramatically reduced the number of supernumeraries, including the figures who here walk so prominently out of the picture plane. He essentially completely erases them. And also he dramatically reduces the numbers of secondary disciples. He introduced, however, some other motifs, a rearing horse in the background, which is actually based on the so-called horse tamers in Rome. Rembrandt never traveled to Italy, but he would have known about them from sources like the one you see down below here, that is Prints, which reproduced what these looked like. And a really interesting motif, that horseman seated in the central background, who is actually based on a Renaissance medal, which he may actually have owned himself. We know he collected, as I'll mention in a few moments, a wide range of objects. He also deepened the curtains of darkness on the sides, which enframed the crucified Christ so that they cast the Virgin and her attendants into shadow. Now, after Rembrandt's death, the plate from which this image was printed passed into the hands of the Amsterdam printer and printmaker Franz Carolez. Now, the only significant change which Carolez made to the plate was to scratch his name and the word excudit, which means printed or published by, into the bottom of the composition. So there it is here, and you can see it here. This, however, created a new posthumous, because Rembrandt was dead, fifth state. Now, judging by the extremely small number of surviving examples of this state, Carolez must have printed a very small number of impressions. In fact, this may be the rarest print in the entire collection. According to the most recent sort of catalogue raisonné of Rembrandt's prints, there are 2 other examples that are known in the world. And in fact, this print was not known to the author of that. I sent him a notice about it. In any case, Jack began corresponding with his London agent about this print, giving him very precise instructions as to what to look for in the impression. And when his agent's report came back positive, the Feddersons decided to purchase it on approval. When the 3 crosses finally arrived the following February, Jack was thrilled and told David Tunick, that dealer in New York who he'd been dealing with quite frequently, about his extraordinary find. Tunick was completely dubious. He just did not believe that this was possible, and was certain that Jack must have been sold a forgery or a copy. However, when he came to see the print in Elkhart, all of his doubts turned to amazement. Jack's instincts had been right all along, and he had obtained an authentic impression of this extremely rare print. And now we have the great pleasure of being able to look at it ourselves here. In the early 1980s, Jack and Elfrida began to consider the fate of their collection. Over the years, they had been in contact with the venerable curator of prints and drawings at the Art Institute, Harold Joachim, and he had apparently encouraged them to donate the works to the Art Institute. But Jack and Elfrida realized that if they gave their Rembrandts to the Art Institute, though they would be well cared for, they would also be lost among the many, many masterpieces in that museum's holdings. And so, after discussions with the then director of the Snite, Dean Porter, and the museum's chief curator, Stephen Spiro, they decided to donate these masterpieces to the university. This was an unexpected, but also very thoughtful act of generosity. It was unexpected because the Feddersons had no real connections with Notre Dame, but they had nonetheless realized that here the prints would be able to be seen more regularly by the public and could also serve as an invaluable research and teaching tool. The etchings were first given on extended loan to the Snite in 1981 as a promised gift, and then when Jack passed away in 1990, they became part of the museum's permanent collection. Let's now turn to the artist himself. Rembrandt Van Rijn was born in the town of Leyden in 1606, the ninth of 10 children. His father, Harmen Gerritsen van Rijn, was a miller, and his mother, Neltje Wilhelmstochter, was the daughter of a baker, so that he came from what we might consider a kind of solid working class background. Rembrandt attended a Latin school in Leyden for about 4 years, and then in 1620, he actually matriculated in the University of Leyden, which was a very distinguished place. It seems unlikely, however, that he ever attended any classes there, because by 1621, he had been apprenticed to a local painter, and fortunately for us, had set out upon his future career. Although we may know him best as a portraitist, Rembrandt's training, both in Leyden and then in Amsterdam, was as a history or narrative painter. And indeed, one of the earliest mentions which we have of this young artist in the contemporary diary of Constantine Huygens, the influential secretary of the Prince of Orange. This was written about 1629-30. So Rembrandt was born, 1606, so he was around 23 or 24 when he came to the attention of Huygens. In this entry, the author praises the artist's ability to tell stories with, quote, strong and effective emotions. He focused particularly in his comment on Rembrandt's work on the Penitent Judas in Rembrandt's 1629 painting of Judas returning the 30 pieces of silver, noting the young artist's ability to, again, quote, bring together in a single figure what is universal. And as we'll see, these same strengths are evident in Rembrandt's religious prints. In 1631, after working for a few years as a painter in Leyden, Rembrandt moved permanently to Amsterdam, undoubtedly attracted by the greater prospects offered by this cosmopolitan center of culture and commerce. He lived initially on the Breestraat, near one of the Jewish synagogues, in a house belonging to an art dealer by the name of Hendrik Eulenburg. Probably with the assistance of Eulenburg, he began to receive portrait commissions, producing extremely effective images which not only captured the likeness of his sitters, but also invested them with a subtle sense of engagement and real presence. One of his earliest portraits is this one of Nicholas Roots, a fur merchant in Amsterdam, and this portrait is actually in New York in the Frick collection. The Frick has an amazing collection of Rembrandt paintings. If you're there, you should visit it. In this work, he not only paints Roots with painstaking care, describing details down to the hairs of his mustache and the light in his moist, slightly rheumy eyes, he also creates a sense of a momentary narrative through Roots's gaze, seems to acknowledge us as we look at him, and his gestures, one hand resting casually on the back of a worn red leather chair, the other holding a note with Rembrandt's name and the painting's date written on it. The following year, in 1632, the artist received a prestigious commission for a group portrait of the Surgeons' Guild and painted the work which is now known as the Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp. Here, with multiple figures, he was able to create an even more expansive narrative, focusing on instructional dissection and a subtext about the marvelous nature of God's most miraculous creation, man, as manifest through the hand. Then, in 1633, probably through the good offices of Huygens, Rembrandt began working on a series of passion paintings for the Prince of Orange, Frederick Hendrik. This commission would occupy him off and on through the mid-1640s. One of Rembrandt's few reproductive prints, that is, a print that reproduces a painting in a graphic medium for larger circulation, is this one here on the left, done in 1633 after the Descent for the Cross, which he had painted for the Prince of Orange. Rembrandt was probably encouraged in this project by Hendrik Eulenburg, who acted as the publisher of this etching, and who may well have intended to produce a series of such large scale prints for general distribution. The only other one which seems to have actually been produced of this series is the Christ before Pilate, which is also visible upstairs. And it is an even more complex image, not based actually on an oil painting, but there is an oil sketch which precedes this. And the Christ before Pilate was done in 1635. The Descent and the Christ before Pilate are two of Rembrandt's largest prints, and the only ones for which he probably falsely claimed, let me see, I've got that. Where is that? Oh, I've lost it. Sorry, there it is. For which he falsely claimed, I didn't realize I had it up there, privileges. If you look down here, this is the signature, which is actually done into the plate down here, and it names Hendrik Eulenburg as the publisher. He's from Amsterdam. But then it says that Rembrandt made it with privileges in the date 1633. Now, what that means is privileges were the 17th century equivalent of copyright. Unfortunately, as I say, there is no evidence that he ever actually got a copyright for this. These are also the only prints by the artist in which he collaborated with another professional printmaker, a man by the name of Jan Georg van Vliet. In the case of the Descent, the printing process naturally resulted in a reversal of the original painting. That said, however, even as Rembrandt translated his polychrome image into a monochromatic etching, he was able to retain the sense of pathos, atmosphere, and drama of the original. And though the symbolic light here seems to emanate from the supremely human body of Christ in the painting, here in the print he has actually reinforced it by overtly drawing shafts of celestial light. The faces of the individual workmen, one of whom actually bears Rembrandt's distinctive features, strain to lower Christ's body down from the cross. The elderly mourners approach from the right, and even the elegantly just Joseph of Arimathea, who stoically watches the scene playing out before him. These figures are all contrasted with two Pharisees tucked into the distant left background, that is, leaders of the Jewish community in the left background, who calmly discuss the tragic event, ignoring its real meaning. Interestingly enough, when Rembrandt went to depict the grieving Virgin, he shielded her from our view behind the silhouetted figure of one of her concerned attendants, perhaps following the well-known example of the ancient painter Timantheus, who decided not to show the face of the grief-stricken Agamemnon as he witnessed the sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia, leaving the depth of that protagonist's suffering to the imagination of the viewer. In 1634, now comfortably settled in Amsterdam with good prospects ahead, Rembrandt courted and married his landlord and employer's cousin, Saskia Eulenburg. Over the next 7 years, Saskia gave birth to 4 children, only one of whom, Titus, born in 1641, survived. Rembrandt's sense of his own rising status, engendered in part by his association with the court of Prince Frederick Hendrik in The Hague through the Passion Cycle, is visible in the self-portrait upstairs, the self-portrait with a velvet cap with a plume in the Feddersen collection. Here, a bewhiskered, dandyish Rembrandt depicts himself wearing an elegant, if somewhat old-fashioned, fur-lined, ornamented satin coat over a slashed jerkin and embroidered blouse. Just visible above his left hand, which is tucked modestly into his coat, are a few links of chain, an allusion to the golden chains which were given by kings and emperors to a few select artists, including Titian, Rubens, and Sir Anthony van Dyck, in recognition of their talents and service. Rembrandt never actually received such an honor, though he did paint a number of self-portraits where he wears golden chains. One other telling detail testifies to his aristocratic aspirations. An errant lock of hair falls over the artist's left shoulder, as it does in this slightly earlier painted self-portrait. This is called a love lock, and it was a hairstyle, kind of like the mullet, which was condemned by contemporary preachers as provocative. It was seen to be sexy. But nonetheless, it was adopted by fashionable young men, particularly those who were connected to the court of The Hague. In 1639, Rembrandt purchased a large brick house on the Breestraat, not far from Eulenburg's, for 13,000 guilders, which is a good sum. But Rembrandt only had to put about 10% down. He contracted to pay off the rest of it with 5% interest in what he hoped would be 6 or 7 years. Unfortunately, this was a debt which ended up dogging him for the next 15 years and which ultimately contributed to his financial ruin. Although Rembrandt continued to receive commissions for portraits and narrative paintings, he also spent lavishly, bidding up prices on some of his own prints in order to keep their market value high, attending auctions where he would purchase paintings and prints, sometimes for really large sums, and accumulating a vast collection of exotica, including a stuffed bird of paradise, an armadillo, shells, plaster casts of body parts and busts of ancient emperors, Renaissance medals, and foreign and old-fashioned costumes, armor, and weapons, materials which he often used in his paintings and prints. 1642 proved to be an auspicious year for the artist. In that year, he painted what is perhaps his most famous group portrait, The Night Watch, or the Shooting Company of Frans Banning Kock, a very large, tumultuous painting in the Rijksmuseum of the mustering of one of Amsterdam's civic militias, in which, as in the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, Rembrandt brilliantly balanced a portraitist's attention to likeness with a history painter's desire for engaging and significant narrative. Interestingly enough, Rembrandt used the same basic compositional structure in his contemporary etching of the biblical story of the triumph of Mordecai, which is something taken out of the book of Esther. In both works, he concentrates the action in the foreground on a relatively shallow stage, which then extends laterally outside the confines of the picture. He enhances the action through variety and strong contrasts of light and shade. He defines the main focus of the composition by a figure who breaks the surface of the picture with a dramatic gesture, as you can see here in both of them. And finally, he divides the compositions, both of them, into 3 sections with a backdrop consisting of a large central arch flanked by massive, classically articulated wings. As dramatic and animated as these images appear, they actually mark out a somewhat more classical phase in Rembrandt's style. But 1642 was also a tragic year, for it was that year that Saskia, weakened by an extended illness following the birth of Titus, died. The artist was deeply affected by her passing, and one sees this reflected in his art. This is a print which you probably barely can make out, called St. Jerome in a Dark Chamber. And you can see, if you look carefully, you can see there is a skull here. It's partially a meditation on death. Eventually, Rembrandt found some solace in the company of a trumpeter's widow by the name of Gertje Dirks, who had been hired as a nurse for Titus. And in fact, we see a burst of creative energy beginning in 1645 and culminating in the end of the decade in what is one of the artist's most spectacular and complex etchings, the so-called 100 Guilder print from 1648. This is a meditation on Matthew 19. The name of this print comes from the price which it fetched in Rembrandt's own lifetime. The smallest of Rembrandt's prints might sell for only a few stivers. There were 20 stivers to a guilder. So 100 guilders for a single print was an astonishing sum. Rembrandt's relationship with Gertje, the trumpeter's widow, collapsed when in 1649 a young maid by the name of Henrike Stoffels from rural Gelderland joined the artist's household. Henrike eventually became Rembrandt's mistress and common-law wife. He couldn't remarry because of a clause in Saskia's will. And she bore him a daughter named Cornelia. Obviously upset by Rembrandt's new partner, Gertje moved out and proceeded to actually sue the artist for breach of promise. She won the case, and Rembrandt was ordered to pay her an annuity of 160 guilders for the rest of her life. But the artist countered her suit by claiming that she was mentally unstable, and actually, over her objections, had her committed to an asylum, which relieved him of having to pay her annuity, not the most admirable moment in his life. About the same time, the artist's financial situation began to deteriorate. In 1653, the men holding the remaining mortgage on Rembrandt's house on the Breestraat demanded final payment, and in order to comply, the artist had to borrow money from friends and clients, sometimes at a high rate of interest. In that same year, work on the building adjacent to his property undermined the foundations of Rembrandt's house, requiring him to undertake extensive and expensive renovations. In addition, he lost a significant amount of money which he had invested in an overseas shipping venture. In spite of all this economic turmoil, or perhaps because of it, in 1654, the year of Cornelia's birth, the artist produced a remarkable number of religious prints. In fact, I think the largest number in his whole life, including a touchingly insightful series dedicated to the childhood of Christ, which I really invite you to look at closely upstairs. We'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. Nonetheless, in 1656, Rembrandt was forced to declare bankruptcy, and in conjunction with the legal process, an inventory called the Cessio Bonorum was drawn up of his movable goods. This document, which still exists, is one of the most important pieces we have of what Rembrandt owned, from the oddities in his collection of curiosities to his small library, and from his vast holdings of prints. It's estimated that he had 4,000 individual prints of his own, to his somewhat more modest collection of paintings. Interestingly enough, there are no paintbrushes, panels, or canvases, easels, presses, plates, or etching needles mentioned in the Cessio Bonorum. And this is probably because these would have been considered the tools of his trade and therefore exempt from the bankruptcy sale. Eventually, everything but the tools of his trade was sold at auction. In an effort to save his house, Rembrandt transferred the title to Titus. But this proved to be a futile gesture, and in 1658, it was sold for 11,000 guilders, 2,000 guilders less than its original price. As disastrous as all of these events may have been, it is clear from the 1658 magisterial, pasha-like self-portrait in the Frick, Rembrandt retained a strong sense of his place as an artist throughout all of his trials. Shortly thereafter, in 1660, Titus and Henrike formed an art dealership, with Rembrandt as their sole employee as a means of protecting him from his creditors. This was necessary because Rembrandt's reputation as a painter still brought him significant commissions, including a prestigious one celebrating the revolt of the Batavians, the ancestors of the Dutch, against their Roman oppressors, a theme which resonated with the contemporary Dutch who had won their independence from Spain. The work was destined to be part of the decorations of the new town hall in Amsterdam. Unfortunately, the last few years of Rembrandt's life was marked by a series of losses. In 1663, Henrike died, probably from the plague, and then in July 1668, Titus, who had married in February of that same year, also passed away, leaving Rembrandt alone with only Cornelia as his companion. Rembrandt himself died on October 4th, 1669, at the age of 63, and he was buried 5 days later in an unmarked, rented grave in the Westerkerk in Amsterdam. We still don't know where his grave is. Before we conclude with a few tips about what to look for in etchings on display upstairs, I just want to briefly go over the manner in which these prints were made. In the 17th century, there were basically two graphic processes which were used by artists and professional print makers, relief and intaglio. In making a relief print, you cut away everything you don't want to print. What remains, that is, what is in relief, is printed. And the most common kind of relief print is the woodcut. And upstairs, there is, in fact, one very spectacular example of this type in the exhibition, Albrecht Dürer's Death of the Virgin from 1619, an impression of which, by the way, Rembrandt certainly owned and which influenced his own rendition of this very same subject. By Rembrandt's day, however, relief techniques had fallen out of favor and intaglio prints were much more common. All of Rembrandt's prints are examples of one type or another of intaglio printing. In intaglio, it is what you cut away that prints. Through the middle of the 17th century, there were basically, and here I show you a plate, 82 of Rembrandt's plates still survive today between public and private collections. This is one which is actually in the National Gallery in Washington, and you can see the plate where the lines have been cut away, and there is a print pulled from it. Through the middle of the 17th century, there were basically three types of intaglio printing. engraving, etching, and dry point. All three of these used a metal plate to print from and a high-pressure roller press to actually transfer the image to paper. In engraving, the artist used a steel V-shaped metal tool called a burin to cut a sharp channel into the surface of a metal plate, thereby creating the lines in which the ink, which will be transferred to the paper, sits. The more pressure the artist applies with the burin, the deeper and wider the resulting channel. Typically, as the artist ends a line, he will release the pressure on the burin, making the channel narrower at its ends, creating what is called a tie or tail. And if you look here, this is a detail, not of a print by Rembrandt, but of an engraving, and you can see how these lines all kind of come to a point at the end. That's a characteristic of engravings. Engraving is a process which requires a great deal of precision, control, and force, and it can result in brilliantly sharp images, and depending on the depth of the channels, can allow from anywhere from 500 to 1,500 good impressions from a single plate. Rembrandt himself never made any pure engravings. It was not a technique which lent itself to his mostly improvisational way of composing. He did, however, occasionally use a burin to add lines for shading and atmosphere. There are several examples of engravings among the comparative images in the exhibition upstairs, including Jacob Matham's engraving after Abraham Blomart's expulsion of Hagar from 1603, and the brilliant impression of Lucas van Leyden's 1513 Adam and Eve, and more to the point of his adoration of the Magi from the same year. The second technique, and the one preferred by Rembrandt, was etching. In this case, the lines or channels are cut into a copper plate by an acid called a mordant, and not by a burin. The artist covers the plate with an acid-resistant substance called the ground, which is usually a mixture of wax and an asphaltum and resin. And then he scratches through the ground with an etching needle, exposing the metal below. In this technique, then, unlike the difficult, highly controlled engraving process, the artist can draw with much more freedom, since the ground doesn't really offer any significant resistance. The plate is then submerged in an acid bath. Rembrandt used a diluted solution of hydrochloric acid as his mordant. The depth of the resulting line is determined by how long the plate is left exposed to the acid. And the result is a much softer, fluid, rounded line than what you see in an engraving. If an artist wished to vary the depth of the line, he could take the plate out of the acid bath, cover over the areas he wanted to be shallower and hence lighter, and then put the plate back into the acid bath to continue the etching process, deepening the still uncovered lines. In the exhibition upstairs, you will see the effects of lightly etching a plate in the print known as The Rest on the Flight into Egypt, lightly etched. Here, the lines are so thinly cut as to make the image of the Holy Family barely visible. It is unique among Rembrandt's surviving etchings, but we know that he intended to have this image have this kind of ghostly quality, because all existing impressions of this etching are just as faint, and the artist actually signed the print, as he often does in the plate. The final intaglio technique is called dry point, and it is something which Rembrandt used with great regularity to add shading and detail to his etchings. He also used dry point more boldly to create two very large prints. The Three Crosses, which we've already looked at, is entirely done in dry point, and Christ presented to the people from about the same time is also done entirely in dry point. Now, to work on dry point on this scale was truly, truly remarkable. And in Rembrandt's case, it was completely successful. In this technique, the artist uses a needle to scratch the image directly into the surface of the plate. Unlike an engraving in which a deep channel is cut into the plate, dry point lines are normally very shallow. Furthermore, whereas metal is actually removed from the plate in the engraving process, creating sharp, clean lines, in dry point, the metal is simply pushed aside, creating what is called a burr or rough edge, which catches the ink and which results in a somewhat more irregular, softer, ragged line. Whereas one can produce hundreds of engravings from a single plate and dozens of good impressions from an etching, dry point only allows for maybe 10 or 12 really good impressions before the image begins to deteriorate. In the collection up above, there is a print in which Rembrandt, reusing a plate which he had obtained from another artist by the name of Hercules Segers, actually uses all three processes. Segers originally represented a scene from the apocryphal book of Tobit of the boy Tobias walking with the archangel Raphael through a hilly forested landscape. Rembrandt scraped out the images of Tobias and the angel and replaced them with Joseph and Mary on the flight into Egypt, though you can still see remnants of the wings of the angel up here. What's particularly interesting is not only the reuse of another artist's plate, which was not that unusual, but also the fact that all three techniques are visible in this image: engraving, etching, and dry point. Now, once an image had been cut into the plate by the burin or acid or dry point needle, the ink was rubbed all over the surface of the plate and into the lines. The excess ink on the plate surface was then wiped off, first with a cloth and then with the palm of the hand. The cleaner the surface, the purer the whites in the final print. Normally, artists tried to get their plates as clean as possible so that each and every print which was pulled or printed from the plate would look like every other one. Rembrandt, however, took a quite different tack. He often left what we call plate or surface tone behind, sometimes a lot and sometimes a little, so that areas of shadow would be darker and areas where he carefully wiped away all the ink would appear brighter. In essence, this made each and every impression a unique one, a monoprint. This technique was particularly effective for images which represented night scenes or nocturnes, which was a very popular genre in the 16th and 17th century, and you'll see several of these upstairs in the exhibition by Rembrandt, and or also for naturally gloomy places such as Christ's tomb. Our impression of the rest on the flight into Egypt, a night piece, for example, has a fairly heavy plate tone. It's the one on the left behind. And you can see that in comparison to this other example, which is in the Rijksmuseum on the right. Both were printed by Rembrandt himself, but as you can see, each one has a kind of unique quality. Once the plate had been cleaned to the artist's satisfaction, it was placed on the bed of a roller press, damp paper was laid on top, and a cloth or cushion on top of that, and the whole sandwich was run through the press. The ink was literally then squeezed out of the lines onto the paper, creating a reversed image, as we noted from the descent from the cross. The pressure of the press on the paper also created what we call a plate mark, and that is what appears to be a raised margin marking out the edges of the plate. Sometimes collectors left this plate mark intact, and sometimes they trimmed the print to the edge of the image itself. This was really an aesthetic decision, though current practice is to leave as much of the original 17th century sheet intact as possible. Once finished, the print was then hung up to dry, and the whole process was ready to begin again with a sheet of paper. Rembrandt was not only innovative in terms of his inking of the plate, but he also was innovative in his choice of papers. Usually, he printed on what was called European laid paper, but in the late 1640s, he also tried printing on papers imported from the East Indies and from Japan. And very rarely, he even printed on calfskin or vellum. Now, vellum is a very hard surface which does not absorb the ink the way the paper does. But because it was associated with manuscripts, which were unique objects, it was a way of imbuing a print with an aura of precious collectability. We are very fortunate to have three rare examples of Rembrandt's etchings on vellum upstairs, the illustrations from Manasseh ben Israel's visionary millenarist treatise, The Glorious Stone. There was one other way to get an image from this process, and that was to print what was called a counterproof. Artists makes a counterproof by taking a still wet impression and laying another clean sheet of paper on top of it, and then running this sandwich through the press so that some of the wet ink is transferred from the bottom sheet onto the top. This obviously re-reverses the image so that it corresponds to what the artist now has directly on his etching plate. He can use this counterproof as a working draft, drawing on it to try out changes. We have two examples of counterproofs in the collection, one of which is particularly instructive but also puzzling, and that is the triumph of Mordecai, the scene from the book of Esther, which we looked at briefly a moment ago. It's instructive simply because we have an impression of the original, and it's puzzling because Rembrandt never made any alterations to the plate, so the counterproof was not intended as a working object. And furthermore, there are an unusually large number of these. One theory is that he did it this way because he was being inspired by this famous print by Lucas van Leyden, and he wanted collectors to be able to make the comparison about how he translated it more directly. Okay, I'd like to now conclude with a brief consideration of some of the things to look for and to consider when you visit, and I hope revisit, the exhibition up above. We have only a few minutes left. First, one thing to keep in mind is that Rembrandt was producing a work for a multi-confessional audience. Though the Dutch Republic was dominated by the Calvinist Dutch Reformed Church, about 30% of the population in Amsterdam belonged actually formally to the church. There was still a remarkable number and variety of faiths allowed to practice in private, from Catholics, who actually still constituted about 15% of the population, that is about half again as much as the Dutch Reformed Calvinists, to Mennonites, from Lutherans to even Jews. Furthermore, Rembrandt was aware that his audience was not limited to Holland. Prints are portable objects and circulated throughout Europe. We know that they were available in Italy, for example, in Rembrandt's own lifetime. Thus, Rembrandt sought to create images which could appeal across confessional boundaries. And I would invite you to look at the two examples in which this is discussed, and I would urge you to read the labels, because Sherrill Snite has done a brilliant job in writing the labels for these. Two examples which make this very clear. One is Rembrandt's translation of the devotional print done by Federico Barocci, a Catholic artist in Italy. He translated it in his own vocabulary, the Virgin and Child in the Clouds, making certain alterations to make it palatable to Protestant and Catholic alike, and also his version of Albrecht Dürer's Death of the Virgin. There are some very significant changes there. The handout that you got will give you some guidance as to what some of those might be, but you might also look at the label. Second, Rembrandt was a consummate storyteller who understood, among other things, the power of variety, of plot and of subplot, of humor and of powerful emotions. One can see, for example, how Rembrandt introduced variety into prints not only through settings, but through his cast of characters. He tells, for example, the story of Joseph recounting his prophetic dreams, which foretells Joseph's ascension over his older brothers, not through the inclusion, the way it appears in many other prints, of the symbolic contents of these dreams, but through the reactions of all of his brothers, his father, and even potentially his mother, to the story. And it's interesting that he opens this composition up in such a way that we also are listening to the story, and we are invited to imagine what is being said. A slightly different example, a different tone predominates in this somewhat chaotic and admittedly very humorous print. I mean, if you look over here, this poor guy is trying to hold on to his cow. This fellow's spilling his money. The dogs are barking over here. This is his version of the merchants and money changers in Christ expelling the money changers from the temple. And of course, in the famous 100 guilder print, the multitudes who have come to be healed are not represented as an undifferentiated mass of marginal and dispossessed characters, but rather as a gathering of individuals, each of whom invites us to project a story on them. The woman, for example, kneeling in prayer beside him, and the one who has collapsed on a litter at his feet, so weak that she can barely raise her hand. The elderly couple, he blind with a goiter, being led through the throng of crowd by his loving wife. And then this strange, exotic Moorish merchant with his pack mule, who has obviously traveled from afar, perhaps coming upon this scene by chance or with his own purpose. He also introduced a variety through the introduction of secondary scenes and figures. For example, in the very small print of the presentation in the temple small plate, he gives us an entire vignette in the background that we play off against the foreground of a priest ministering to some pious Jews as curtains are being pulled aside. In the Healing at the Beautiful Gate, we are afforded a view into a reconstruction of the temple, of the Herodian temple, including Solomon's porch with its massive staircase and the two colossal pillars, Boaz and Jachin, the great Babylonian curtain, and the enormous burnt offering altar. All of this is tucked into the background here and available for us to lose ourselves into the space. And he also introduces figures who can serve as surrogates, figures who peer out of windows and observe the way we do, or who sit beside the main action, studying ancient tomes in search of, in this case, an answer to this strangely charismatic preacher that is over here. These secondary figures, like us, sometimes are distracted, but sometimes rapt. They watch and they discuss just as we might while we carefully scrutinize the prints in our hand. Finally, tellingly revealing interior emotions of his actors through expression and body language, again offers a way of infusing his sacred narratives with more than just sacred values, universal values. And they invite not only a kind of dispassionate observation, but also empathy. For example, the way in which he translates the sacramental moment of Christ's agony in the garden, and this print is upstairs by Dürer, into something which now deals with God's consoling touch. This is a unique way of looking at this moment. The way in which he portrays the anguish of Jacob at the loss of his child, the extraordinary pain in his face as he's shown Joseph's bloody coat, the revealing uncertainty and sorrow of Abraham, and the spiteful glee of Sarah as the patriarch is forced to send Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness. And imagining the remarkable epiphanic encounters with the miraculous, which sometimes come in dramatically explosive fashions of divine light or transformation, as in these two prints, or sometimes through a dawning revelation, a recognition of the divine manifest through a simple act of breaking bread. But finally, one theme which seems to have held a special personal importance for Rembrandt is the importance of family, the relationship between parents and children in general, and fathers and sons in particular. From the obvious theme of the forgiving father and wayward son, which he portrays in The Prodigal Son here, to Joseph's actions in that 1654 Childhood of Christ series of etchings, which I referred to a moment ago, where here, for example, in the Adoration of the Magi, he proudly, like any father, shows off his newborn son to the adoring shepherds at the side, or in a slightly different way, wistfully seems to be gazing into the space, this interior domestic space, from outside, observing the special bond of a loving mother and her child in the Virgin and Child with the cat and the snake. But the complicated nature of the relationship between the parent and child is particularly clear in three subjects which the artist actually seems to have invented. The first two are drawn from the story of Abraham, and each one anticipates a more familiar and dramatic moment which follows. The first is Abraham caressing Isaac, and here we see a mischievously joyful and innocent child, Isaac, whose name literally means laughter in Hebrew, leaning against the knees of his elderly father. Abraham absent-mindedly caresses the boy's head and looks warily out at us, as though contemplating the painful choice which he has been forced upon him by God's commandment to choose this miraculously conceived child over his firstborn son, Ishmael. The second etching depicts Abraham and Isaac on the road to Mount Moriah, the site of the sacrifice of Isaac. The patriarch, burdened by the knowledge of this awful task, has set down the pan of burning coals which he has brought along for the incomprehensible Holocaust sacrifice which God has ordered him to perform. He leans forward, one hand raised, the other laid across his heart, and tells his patient son that God will provide, anticipating the moment of the sacrifice atop the mount which follows. It is an image which invites us to ponder the nature of faith, Abraham's faith in God and a child's faith in his father. And the last etching depicts a different kind of imagined event, one following a dramatic encounter. It is the Holy Family's journey back to Nazareth after Mary and Joseph have discovered Jesus disputing with the elders in the temple. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know that I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. And then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. This etching, then, is nominally about the family's journey back home, but it considers not only the implications of Jesus' revelation for his parents, but on an even more fundamental and universal level, the dilemma of all parents who must at some point come to terms with their children's passage from child into adult, and the need to release them so that they may follow their own fate. In this context, I think it is telling that Rembrandt's own son, Titus, was 12 years old in 1654, the very same age as Jesus. Well, one final bit of advice before I release you, and that is please look closely at the prints upstairs. There are magnifying glasses up there, if you can. There are only 3 of them, but if you can use them, I would advise you to do so. And remember, these are intimate objects meant to be examined carefully. And to help you do that, I have prepared that little handout of questions which you could have gotten when you came in, and there's still some probably available there. Some of them are serious, some less so, and one of them is the challenge to count the dogs. The answers will be posted on the Snite webpage on Monday. And finally, if you actually want to know a lot more about any or all of Rembrandt's prints in the exhibition, I might modestly recommend to you my lavishly illustrated catalog, handsomely produced by the Snite Museum of Art and Indiana University Press. It includes a short history of the formation of the collection, a brief overview of Rembrandt as a maker of religious prints, and extensive individual essays on every print in the collection. And it is only $70 and will make a magnificent Christmas present. And as an added incentive to get one right now, I'll be upstairs in the gallery answering your questions, but also signing copies of the catalog. Thank you for your patience. Actually, we're supposed to be out of here now. I will entertain maybe 1 or 2 questions, but if you really have one, I will be upstairs like in a second. So is there anybody? Okay, you're released. Thank you.